Most trouble in the woods gives you time. You hear it first, or you smell it, or you see the signs building up, and you can make choices. You can step back. You can change direction. You can slow down and let things settle. I learned that over years of working Montana backcountry. This time, it did not build slowly. The first sign of danger showed up only seconds before it was already too close. I had training. I had experience. I had done more solo miles than I can count. None of that prepared me for how fast control could be taken away. I am telling this as plain as I can, the way I remember it. No exaggeration, no wild theory, no big speech. Just what happened out there and why I still think about it when the forest goes quiet. I have worked as a state ranger in Montana for a long time. Most of my time is not exciting. It is slow patrols, checking trailheads, watching for illegal fires, helping lost hikers, and keeping an eye on problem areas. A lot of it is just reading the land and making sure the little problems do not turn into big ones. I am used to predators. I know how wolves move. I know how a cougar makes the whole place feel wrong, even when you cannot see it. I know bears, and I know how a bear can go from calm to dangerous in 1 second if you surprise it. I have dealt with aggressive elk during rut and with people who think the rules do not apply to them. I also know the normal rhythm of a Montana forest. Birds carry the background noise. Wind gives you direction and distance. Squirrels and small animals fill in the gaps. Even when it is quiet, it is not dead. It is just calm. The day this happened, I was assigned to check a remote section of forest. It was one of those areas where access is limited and the terrain pushes most people away. You can get in, but it takes effort, and once you are in there, you are on your own for a while. The weather was stable. Visibility was good. Cold enough to keep things crisp, but not so cold you lose feeling in your hands. The sky was clear. No storm building. No heavy wind. It felt like a normal patrol day. I drove as far as I could on an old service road and parked where the track stopped being worth it. From there, it was on foot. I had my usual pack, water, radio, first aid, some basic tools, and a sidearm like always. Nothing special, nothing different. I also had the calm that comes with routine. For the first part of the hike, nothing felt strange. The ground was firm. The trees were spaced enough to see ahead. I moved at a steady pace, keeping to a loose route that let me check a few key spots. I watched for fresh tire tracks where they should not be, for dumped trash, for signs someone had cut timber without permission. I was thinking about normal things. A bridge that needed attention. A spot where people kept lighting fires too close to deadfall. A creek crossing that gets sketchy when it warms up. Just simple work thoughts. Then the forest changed without warning. It was not like a sudden noise or a scream. It was the opposite. It went quiet in a way I do not like. Birds stopped first. Not slowly, not one by one, but like someone took a hand and pressed it over the whole place. The little movement in the canopy ended. I realized I could hear my own boots with more sharpness than I should. The wind died next. It was not a gust that stopped. It was like the air itself held still. My face felt it. That soft, steady push was gone. The branches that had been moving were suddenly fixed in place. I stopped walking and stood there, letting my eyes work. I did not feel panic. I felt pressure. That is the best word for it. Like something heavy was being held close. Not fear exactly, but the sense that the forest was waiting on something. I looked around and listened. Nothing. No rustle. No distant creek sound. Just an empty stillness. In my job, I have learned to respect that kind of shift. Animals go quiet when something strong is close. Sometimes it is a cougar. Sometimes it is a bear moving through. Sometimes it is people. A group of people can change the woods too, because everything that lives out there knows what humans can do. I started moving again, slower. I kept my head on a swivel. I was not hunting for anything. I just wanted to see enough to understand what changed. About 10 minutes later, I found the first physical sign. It was off the established trail, in a strip of timber where the ground dropped slightly and the undergrowth thinned. At first, it just looked like a few trees that had taken storm damage. Then I got closer and saw the pattern did not match. Bark had been stripped high off trunks, higher than shoulder height, in long rough sections. The exposed wood underneath was pale and fresh. Branches were broken above my head, not snapped by snow load, but snapped like something strong grabbed and twisted. A couple of saplings were bent and folded in ways that looked intentional, not random. I put a hand on one trunk and looked up. The stripping started around 6 feet and went higher. A bear can strip bark, but the marks and height were wrong. Elk will rub, but not like this. This looked like something had worked the trees. Like it was leaving a sign, not by accident. I crouched and checked the ground. The soil was hard, but I could see scuffed places, compressed patches, and a few deep impressions that did not look like hoof or paw. They were not clean enough to call tracks, but they were heavy enough to tell me something large had been here. I stood up and took a slow breath. I did not like any of it, but strange damage alone does not equal immediate danger. I told myself it might be a mix of animals and weather, and that I was overthinking because the quiet had set my nerves on edge. Then I heard the first movement. It was not close. It was off to my left, beyond a line of thick trees. Heavy footfalls, spaced out, not hurried. The sound traveled through the ground more than through the air. That deep thump you feel more than hear, like when a big animal steps on packed earth. I froze and listened. The steps paused. I waited. After a few seconds, I shifted my weight, and the steps started again. Same pace, same distance. Like whatever it was had been moving and stopped, because I stopped. That is not how deer behave. That is not how elk behave when they are spooked. That is not how bears move when they are just traveling. It felt measured. It felt like it was matching me. I moved a few steps and stopped again. The footfalls matched. Stop and stop, move and move. The distance stayed the same. It did not close in, but it did not drift away either. I told myself it could be a person. People sometimes move that way, trying not to be seen, keeping pace while staying off the trail. It made sense in a bad way. I had dealt with poachers and with people doing things they should not be doing. I called out a routine ranger warning in the way we do, loud enough to carry, but not aggressive. I got no answer, no response. No cough, no rustle, nothing. The footfalls shifted slightly, still off to my left, still parallel. I did not like that. I started moving toward more open ground. There was a stretch ahead where the trees spread out and the slope leveled. If it was a person, I wanted better sight lines. If it was an animal, open ground gives you a bit more warning. As I moved, the forest started to feel restrictive in a way I had never felt in that area. The trees that had been spaced out now seemed to tighten. The brush seemed thicker. Every line of sight ended too soon. It felt like the land was closing in. That is when I caught the first glimpse. It was quick. A large upright shape between two trunks, maybe 40 or 50 yards out. For half a second, my mind tried to label it as a bear standing up. That was the fastest explanation, and the one my brain wanted. But the shape was wrong. The shoulders were too broad. The arms were too long. The stance was too balanced. It was not struggling for balance. It was just there, upright, like standing on two legs was normal. Then it slipped behind trees, and the view was gone. I stood still, trying to calm my breathing. I took another look in the same direction, but the forest swallowed everything. No movement, no sound. I told myself to be careful and methodical. I did not want to panic and make a mistake. I also did not want to stay in a blind spot with unknown movement around me. I angled toward that open patch again, but I did it with care, making sure I was not walking into a funnel. I kept checking my sides. I kept my shoulders loose and my head up. As I moved, the sounds shifted ahead of me. A branch snapped farther up the slope in the direction I was heading. Then another snap came from a slightly different angle. It was not random. It was like the movement had jumped forward, cutting across to get in front of me. I stopped and listened. I could tell there was more than one point of sound now. Not clearly two separate creatures, but enough to make me feel surrounded. A snap on the right, a thump on the left. Then nothing. Then another snap closer. I realized I was being cut off. It was not a sudden attack. It was a change in positioning. Whatever was out there was not following behind anymore. It was working around, controlling where I could go. My pulse went up. I swallowed and forced myself to keep thinking. I checked my map and my mental layout. There was a downhill route to my right that led toward rockier ground. There was also a thicker timber section behind me that I did not want to push into without a clear reason. The open patch was now less open than it seemed, because the sounds were ahead of it. I shifted direction again, trying to regain control of sight lines. That is when the Dogman showed itself enough to remove any doubt. It stepped into partial view, not fully out in the open, but close enough that I saw its outline clearly. Upright, balanced, head level well above mine. The head shape was canine, with a muzzle, not flat like a bear. The shoulders were huge. The arms hung long and heavy. The legs were set in a way that looked built for both speed and power. It did not bolt. It did not flinch. It did not behave like a wild animal surprised by a human. It stood and stared like it had been deciding when to let me see it. My brain tried to fight it, because seeing something like that does not fit what you think the woods hold. But the moment lasted long enough that my denial had nowhere to hide. That was a Dogman. I had no other label that matched the shape and the way it held itself. I did not feel curiosity. I felt a cold, direct danger. The Dogman did not show fear. There was no frantic movement, no uncertainty. It looked at me like I was in the wrong place, and it already knew what it was going to do about it. The danger came fast, right after that. The Dogman closed distance in a way that should not have been possible for something that big. It moved with speed, and the worst part was how quiet it was. I expected heavy crashing. I expected branches breaking and loud footfalls. Instead, it came like a shadow, fast and controlled, using cover without losing pace. My body backed away before my mind could finish the thought. I stepped back, then another step, eyes locked on it. I tried to angle to my left, but the terrain forced me downhill. The ground dropped into uneven earth and rock, and I felt my balance go. I caught myself, but it cost me position. In the woods, position matters. If you stumble, you lose time, and time is space. The Dogman took advantage of that small loss, like it had been waiting for it. It did not rush recklessly. It used the slight elevation above me and shifted its line, so I had to keep moving down and back. It felt like hurting. I do not like using that word, but that is how it felt. Not a blind chase, but pressure that guided me toward worse footing. I looked for my best escape route. Dense timber was on one side. Open ground was now behind the Dogman. The slope ran down toward a rocky outcrop I knew from past patrols. If I could reach that rock, I could change elevation fast and maybe create a boundary the Dogman would not cross. I made that decision quickly, because hesitation was not an option. I started moving, not sprinting at first, because running on uneven ground makes you fall. I moved fast but controlled, stepping over roots, keeping my weight low, eyes flicking between the path and the Dogman. Behind me, the heavy footfalls followed. Now I could hear them more clearly. Not crashing, but strong, steady, close enough to tell me It was maintaining pressure and not letting me slow down. It did not need to catch me right away. It just needed to keep me moving. I glanced back and saw it in a gap between trees. It was closer than I thought. Teeth visible for a second when it opened its mouth slightly. Not a full snarl, not a bark, just a display that made my stomach tighten. The smell hit me as it closed in. A strong odor like wet dog mixed with old meat and a musky rot that felt too heavy for normal wildlife. It carried on the still air and seemed to stick in my throat. That smell made it real in a new way. Sound and sight can fool you. Smell like that is hard to doubt. I pushed through a strip of brush and branches snapped at my shoulders. I felt scratches on my forearms and neck. I did not stop. I could feel my breathing getting rough, and I forced myself to keep it steady. Then the Dogman did something that almost ended it. It appeared from cover to my side, so sudden that the distance collapsed in one moment. I had been watching behind me, expecting it to be on my line. It used that expectation against me. It came from the side and showed itself just a few yards away. For a second I saw the full body, thick chest, long arms. The head tilted slightly, eyes fixed on me. It did not look confused. It looked focused, like it was testing how I would react. My body jerked away, and my foot slid on loose rock. I went down to one knee. My hand hit the ground hard. Pain shot up my wrist. I shoved myself up, but the stumble cost me again. The Dogman stepped forward, fast noticing it. It lunged several steps, then stopped just short, like it had slammed on brakes. It was close enough that I could see the texture of its fur and the shape of its muzzle. It was close enough that I could hear its breathing. It did not strike. That is the part that still sits in my head. It had the distance. It had the angle. It could have ended me in one move. Instead, it stopped, held that space, and let me understand it could close it whenever it wanted. That was a direct threat, and it was controlled. Survival instinct took over fully after that. Any idea of standing my ground or trying to scare it off was gone. I was not dealing with a normal animal. I was dealing with something that had already taken the advantage and knew it. I focused on moving, not on winning. I picked the route that got me to rock. I cut through dense timber because it was the fastest line to that outcrop. I knew it favored the Dogman. Big things can move through brush in ways humans cannot. But I did not have better options. The pursuit stayed with me, heavy steps behind. Occasional snapping of branches that sounded too close. It was not trying to lose me. It was not getting distracted. It was just applying pressure. My lungs burned. My throat felt dry. I could feel sweat under my layers, cooling as it hit the air. My hands shook a little, and I forced them steady. I reached a small opening where I could see ahead. The rock outcrop was there, gray and jagged, rising from the slope like a broken tooth. It was not huge, but it was enough to change elevation quickly if I hit it right. I ran harder the last stretch, taking the risk because the goal mattered. Behind me, the footfalls closed in. I did not look back. I had learned that looking back was wasting time, and time was what it was trying to take. I hit the base of the rock and climbed, using hands and boots, pulling myself up onto a ledge. Loose gravel slid under my feet. I dug in and kept moving upward. Then I heard the Dogman stop. It was sudden, like the whole chase hit an invisible line. The heavy steps ended. No branch snaps. Just silence again, and my breathing loud in my ears. I crawled up to a higher point and turned, keeping low. The Dogman stood at the edge of the timber line below the rock. It was fully visible now. Chest heaving slightly, head lifted, eyes locked on me. It did not pace. It did not circle. It just stood there, like the boundary had been drawn, and it respected it, or claimed it. I stayed still, watching. For a long moment, neither of us moved. It felt like a standoff, but not in a human way. more like a decision point. It had driven me to the rock. It had kept the pressure. Now it was holding the line. I expected it to rush the rock anyway. I expected it to climb, to show it could cross any boundary. It did not. Instead, it took one slow step back, and another. It did not turn away. It did not show its back. It backed into the timber like it was keeping eyes on me until it no longer needed to. It disappeared deliberately, like it was choosing to end the encounter on its terms. The forest stayed silent after it vanished. No birds came back right away. No wind started. It was like the place was holding its breath, even after it was gone. I stayed on that rock longer than I needed, because I did not trust the silence. My hands were shaking now that I was not moving. Adrenaline makes you strong and steady until it stops, and then it shows you what you just lived through. I forced myself to breathe slowly and look around. I scanned the tree line. I checked the slope. I listened for any movement. Nothing. After a while, I climbed down carefully on the opposite side of the rock, keeping the stone between me and where I last saw the Dogman. I moved slow, making sure my footing was solid. Once I was back on the ground, I checked the area where the Dogman had stood. The ground was mixed rock and hard soil, but there were impressions. Deep tracks, not clean like in mud, but enough to show weight and shape. The stride spacing was wide. The toes were not like a bear. The marks looked like something that could run on two legs, but still had a foot shaped for traction. I followed the signs a short distance into the rough terrain. The tracks faded fast, like it had stepped into places that do not hold prints. It did not leave a neat trail. It moved through a landscape that hid it. That told me something important. It knew where to go to leave less behind. I did not stay to play detective. I did not measure or take pictures. I did not want to be in that spot a second longer than I needed. I marked the general location in my mind, then I started the long walk back toward my vehicle, taking the safest line I could. As I walked, the forest slowly returned. A bird call here and there, a small gust of wind. The normal sounds, but my body did not relax. I kept scanning, because I knew how fast it had shifted before. When I finally reached the road in my truck, I felt relief so strong it made me weak. I leaned a hand on the door and just stood there for a second, staring back into the trees. Nothing followed me to the road. There was no lost threat, no final show. It ended clean, like the Dogman had allowed the ending. That thought hit me hard on the drive out. It could have ended it fast. I believe that with no doubt. It had multiple moments where it could have closed the distance and used strength that no human can match. Instead, it hurted. It tested. It threatened. It drew a line. Then it withdrew. The restraint bothered me more than a wild, chaotic attack would have. Chaos is easier to understand. Restraint suggests choice. Over the next days, the memory replayed itself in pieces. The silence, the stripped bark, the footfalls matching my pace, the first upright shape, the way it moved in without sound, the smell, the close-range lunge that stopped short. I kept asking myself what I could have done differently. I kept looking for a normal explanation that would make it less strange. I did not find one. I went back over the terrain in my head, the way it shifted ahead of me, the way sounds came from different points, the way it angled me downhill. It did not feel like a chance encounter. It felt like a controlled encounter. That is a hard thing to accept when you work in the woods. You want to believe the land is neutral and the animals are predictable. You learn patterns and you lean on them. This broke that comfort. After that day, I avoided that section of forest. I did not announce it. I did not make a big report. I just altered my patrol routes. I found reasons to check other areas first. I kept my distance. It is not fear that drives that choice now. It is respect and a kind of caution that comes from knowing something out there can decide how close you get. When I am out on patrol now, I still enjoy the work. I still like the quiet. I still like the simple routine. But there is a line in my mind that was not there before. If the forest goes quiet in that heavy way, I do not ignore it. I stop. I listen. I back out if I have to. I do not press into it just because I have done the route 100 times before. That day taught me that some warnings come without sound and without mercy if you ignore them. The Dogman did not need to roar. It did not need to attack to prove the point. Before that day, I believed I knew what fast danger looked like. I have had a bear pop out of alder at 10 feet and come up on hind legs. I have had a bull elk swing his rack at my truck door. I have had a cougar scream at night, close enough that it felt like it was inside my tent. Those moments are sudden, but they still have rules. They still feel like animal reactions. This did not feel like a reaction. It felt like a decision. The remote section I was checking has a way of making you feel alone, even on a clear day. The drainage there twists, and the ridges block radio in spots. The timber is a mix of old pine, fir, and thick stands where the light barely reaches the ground. There are places where you can walk for hours without seeing a clear line more than 50 yards. It is not dangerous on paper, but it is the kind of terrain that can hide anything. I knew there had been a few odd calls over the past year. Not official complaints, more like vague reports passed around between locals. People saying they heard heavy steps at night near their camp. People saying they saw something tall move between trees and disappear. Most of those reports end up being bears or elk or just nerves. I did not treat it as a special problem. It was just another quiet corner that needed checking. When I started the hike in that morning, I followed a familiar line along a slope above a creek. It is the kind of route you pick because it keeps you dry and gives you some visibility. The ground there is usually littered with pine needles, which can be noisy if you are not careful. I moved slow enough to keep a low sound profile, mostly out of habit. I kept noticing small things, but nothing that screamed danger. A set of old wolf tracks, a couple days faded, some deer scat, a broken limb from a past wind event. That is normal. Nothing new. I remember the exact moment I realized the quiet was wrong. It happened after I crossed a narrow draw where the trees grow tight. I stepped out of the thicker section and expected the usual bird chatter to start again. It did not. I stopped and waited, thinking maybe I had just hit a lull. Then I realized even the insects were absent. It was like the whole place had shut down. In training, we talk about the woods going quiet. People joke about it, like it is a movie thing. But it is real. It is not mystical. It is a pattern. Prey animals stop moving and stop making noise when something dominant is close. Sometimes the dominant thing is a predator you can name. Sometimes it is a human. The result is the same. Everything that lives there becomes careful. The pressure I felt was like someone standing behind you in an empty room. You cannot see them, but you know they are there because your body reacts. My skin tightened. My shoulders rose. My breathing got shallow. It was not panic, just a signal. I checked the wind even though it had died. I licked a finger and held it up. Nothing. No drift. No direction. That made it harder because smell and sound become less reliable when the air is locked. I did a slow turn, scanning tree trunks, looking for anything that did not fit. A black shape that should not be there. A break in the pattern. A flicker of motion. I saw nothing, but that did not help, because seeing nothing is part of the problem when something is hiding well. I started moving again and kept my pace steady, because jerky movement can trigger chase behavior in animals and can also make you look like prey. That thought was automatic. I do that when I see a bear at distance. You control your movements. You keep options open. The tree damage I found was spread out over a wider area than I first thought. As I walked around, I realized it was not one tree. It was several. Some had bark stripped. Some had deep gouges. A few had what looked like claw marks, but the spacing was not like bear claw spacing. The marks were farther apart and deeper, like a hand with long fingers had pressed in and raked down. One trunk had bark peeled in a long vertical strip that started high and ended lower, as if something had reached up and dragged down. Another had a section where the bark was torn sideways. That sideways tier stood out, because animals usually rake down, not across. The branches above were broken in a way that looked like leverage. Thick limbs that would resist snow were snapped at the base, like something had pulled them until they gave. When a branch breaks under snow load, it often splits and leaves ragged fibers. These breaks were cleaner, and the branch was thrown aside. I looked around for bear sign. Bears leave scat, hair, tracks, and a certain kind of disturbance. I did not see it. I did not see claw prints at ground level. I did not see the usual patterns of rub marks. That absence was not proof of anything, but it removed the easiest explanation. The ground impressions bothered me. The soil was hard, but where it was soft, the compressions had a heel-like back and a forward pressure point. Not a paw, not a hoof. It looked like weight on two contact points, alternating. It was not enough to make a claim, but it was enough to make me cautious. When the footfall started, I listened for rhythm. Four-legged animals have a different cadence. Even a bear moving on all fours has a pattern you can feel if you have been around it enough. These steps were spaced like two legs, one after the other, with a slight pause between sets. Too deliberate to be a rush. Too heavy to be a normal person unless they were carrying a lot. The way it stopped when I stopped was the first thing that raised the hair on my neck. Humans mirror like that. Predators can too, but it is less common unless they are stalking with intent. And it did not feel like curiosity. It felt like control. I tried one more routine move we use when we suspect someone is in the area. I shifted to a louder walk on purpose, making it clear I was not trying to sneak. Sometimes people who are up to something will reveal themselves if they know you have heard them. Sometimes they speak up to avoid trouble. Nothing happened. I also tried to force a sound response by tapping my trekking stick against a rock and then staying still. The noise echoed a little. After that, the footfalls resumed, still measured, still out of sight, still tracking my pace. It was at that point I made a quiet plan. Get to open ground, get a clear view, then decide whether I was walking back or calling for help. The first glimpse between trees was not a clean look, but it was enough to show height and posture. I have seen bears stand. Bears always look unstable in that posture, even big ones. They sway. Their shoulders sit differently. Their heads are rounder. This shape did not sway. It held itself like standing was its default. After that glimpse, I realized how narrow my sightlines really were. The terrain had a way of turning every direction into a blind corner. It is not just trees. It is the way the slope folds. It is the way the brush fills gaps. You can be 50 yards from something and never see it if it knows how to use that cover. The sounds shifting ahead of me made me feel like I was losing a simple map of the space. I like to know where I am in relation to whatever is out there. If it is behind me, I can keep it behind me. If it is to the side, I can angle away. When the sound jumped forward, it took away that simple control. I remember thinking, for a split second, that I might be dealing with two things. Not because I clearly heard two sets of steps, but because the snapping and movement came from angles that did not fit one straight line. Then I saw the Dogman step into partial view, and it all snapped into place as a single problem again. The posture and the head shape were the most shocking part. A bear face is blunt and wide. A cougar is sleek. This was canine. A muzzle that came forward, ears set high. The head sat on shoulders without a long neck, like the whole upper body was built for pulling and biting. The Dogman did not make noise. It did not vocalize. It did not warm. It just watched. I have been stared down by wildlife before. A bear will glance, assess, and usually move on if it is not defensive. Wolves will watch from distance, but keep space. A cougar, if it is close, is usually trying not to be seen. The dogman did not try to hide once it chose to show itself. It let me see it, and it did not flinch. The closing distance was where the danger turned immediate. The speed was not just fast. It was sudden acceleration, like going from standing still to full movement without a build-up. And the silence was wrong. Something that big should make the woods complain. It should snap branches. It should crash through brush. It did not. It moved with control, using its weight in a way that made very little sound. That silence made me feel blind. Sound is a big part of how you track movement in timber. If the sound is minimal, you lose the early warning. When the terrain forced me downhill, it felt like a trap. Going downhill can be good if the slope is clean, but this slope was mixed rock and roots, and a fall there can end you even without an animal involved. The dogman held the higher line for a moment, then angled to keep me moving the way it wanted. That is the part one still replay. Herding does not need actual contact. It is just pressure and positioning. It is letting the prey choose, but only within a narrow set of choices. I tried to keep my eyes on it, but you cannot watch a predator and also watch your footing perfectly. You have to split attention, and that split is where mistakes happen. I stumbled twice in those minutes. Not full falls, but slips that forced me to use hands. Each one took time. Each one allowed it to tighten the space. When it lunged and stopped short, the message was clear. It wanted to see what I would do. Would I freeze? Would I run? Would I try to raise my arm? Would I reach for my sidearm? Would I face it? I did not draw my weapon. That choice was not bravery. It was calculation. At that distance, if I reached and it decided to strike, I would not have time. Also, I do not know what effect a weapon would have on something like that in the few seconds I would have. Drawing could have been the trigger that made it decide the test was over. So I moved. I put everything into choosing a line and holding it. Dense timber, brush, rock, whatever it took. In that moment, I did not think about proving anything. I only thought about getting to a terrain feature that gave me a chance. The pursuit felt like it had a rhythm. It stayed close, then eased slightly, then closed again. Like it was making sure I did not slow down. If I slowed, it would tighten. If I pushed too hard and stumbled, it would tighten. It kept me in that narrow band where I was always one mistake away from losing the last space. I got hit by brush hard enough that it left welts on my cheek and forehead. I took a branch to the eye area that made my vision water. I kept moving anyway, because pain was less important than distance. When the dogman appeared from the side again, that was the closest I have ever been to losing control completely. Surprise is dangerous. If you jump wrong on uneven ground, you go down. It used that timing perfectly. It showed itself just when my attention was on the path. The smell at that range was powerful. It was not just an animal smell. It had a layered stink, like wet fur and something decaying, and a deep musky element that felt like it belonged to a large predator. It made my stomach turn and my mouth dry. I also remember the eyes, not the color, because in that light and that moment, I cannot claim a color, but the focus. It was not wild. It was direct. It looked like it was tracking my center of mass, my hands, my movement, the way a trained animal might. That thought is uncomfortable. I do not like implying anything that I cannot prove, but the behavior looked organized. The rock outcrop was not far, but it felt far because every step felt like it could be the one that put me on the ground. When I reached it and climbed, I felt the first real shift in control. Rock gives you a line. It gives you an edge. It forces the other thing to decide whether to commit. The dogman chose not to commit. It stopped at the edge of the timber like there was a boundary, It did not want to cross. It stood there and watched. The standoff lasted long enough that my legs started shaking. I was so full of adrenaline that when it started to drain, my muscles did not know what to do with themselves. During that standoff, I scanned the ground below and the tree line around it, because part of me still wondered if I had misread the earlier multiple sounds. I saw nothing else, just the Dogman and the empty timber. It was fully visible then, more than it had been at any other point. The proportions were clear. It was not a man in a suit. That idea does not survive at that distance when you see how the shoulders slope, how the arms hang, how the legs set, how the head sits. It looked built, not dressed. It backed away slowly, never turning, and disappeared without noise. That exit was as deliberate as the approach. That is another thing that keeps me thinking. Predators often leave quickly when they decide they are done. This did not bolt. It withdrew like it was closing a door. After it vanished, I waited because I did not trust the timing. In the woods, predators can leave, circle, and come back on a different line. I stayed on the rock and kept my back against stone to reduce angles. When I finally climbed down, I moved with care, scanning constantly. The world felt thin, like any moment could break open again. The tracks were not clean, but they were there, deep enough to show weight. The shape at the front looked like toes, and the heel area looked compressed in a way that suggested a foot, not a paw. I did not follow far, because the terrain stopped holding sign quickly. It stepped onto rock, dry needles, and hard dirt where prints vanish. On the way back to my truck, I took a wider route than I came in. I chose ridge lines instead of bottoms. I stayed in places where I could see farther. I avoided tight timber. It added miles, but it made me feel less boxed in. I did not see it again, but I felt watched twice. That same pressure. Each time, I stopped and listened, and forced myself not to rush. I waited until the pressure eased, and the forest made a small sound again. Then I moved. By the time I reached the truck, my body was exhausted, like I had been running for hours. Fear does that. It burns fuel fast. I drove out slow, because my hands were still shaking on the wheel. I kept checking the rearview mirror, even though that makes no sense on a forest road. I knew it would not follow the road like a normal animal, but my brain needed to check anyway. That night, after I got home, I did not sleep well. Every small sound outside my window made me sit up. I kept replaying that lunge that stopped short. I kept thinking about how close it was, and how small the line is between a close call and a body on the ground. The next day, in daylight, I looked at the scratches on my arms and the bruise forming on my wrist. They were minor injuries from the terrain, but they reminded me how quickly a simple slip could have ended it. In the weeks after, I found myself scanning more during normal patrols. Places I used to walk without thought started to feel like places that could hide something. Not every place. Most places still feel normal. But that section, and anything that reminds me of it, carries a different weight. I did not tell many people. Not because I wanted to keep a secret, but because I know how it sounds. I also know that saying it out loud can change how you see your work. It can turn a normal patrol into something you dread. I did not want to become someone who jumps at shadows. But I also did not want to pretend it did not happen. So I made practical changes. I adjusted patrol timing. I avoided being deep in that section near late afternoon when light drops and shadows lengthen. I started carrying an extra layer and more water, even on short hikes, because if you have to take a long way out, you need the basics. I also made sure my radio checks were more regular in areas where reception is weak, not because I expected help, but because a habit can save you when your head is not clear. The biggest change was in how I read quiet. Before, if birds stopped, I would pause, note it, and keep moving with caution. Now, if the forest goes dead in that heavy way, and the wind holds still, I treat it like a boundary. I stop and I listen longer. I check behind. I check both sides. If I cannot regain a normal rhythm, I back out. Some people would call that being spooked. I call it learning. I have worked long enough to know that the backcountry does not care about your confidence. It does not care about your title or your training. It rewards attention and punishes pride. That day reminded me of that truth, the sharpest way. Months later, I passed near the edge of that same area on a different route, not on purpose, just because my work took me close. The day was calm, and the birds were active. The wind moved. It felt normal. But when I looked into the deeper timber where the slope drops, I felt the old pressure for a second, like a memory in my body. I turned away and kept going. I did not test it. I also noticed that I still scan for stripped bark when I move through similar terrain. I notice break heights. I notice when branches are snapped high. I cannot help it. Once you see a pattern like that tied to danger, your brain stores it. It is possible the Dogman still uses that area. It is possible it moved on long ago. I do not know. What I do know is that the woods there feel occupied in a way that is hard to describe to someone who has not felt it. Occupied does not mean noisy. Occupied does not mean obvious. It means there is a sense of presence that changes how you move and how you think. That is the lasting impact. I used to think the most dangerous thing about the backcountry was distance, weather, and the normal predators. Those are still dangers. But now I also know that something can take control of a situation faster than your mind can catch up, and that training does not always cover what you have not imagined. The hardest part is not telling the story. The hardest part is knowing how close it was, and knowing that the Dogman's restraint was part of the danger. If it had charged and attacked, it would be simple. You would say it was an animal doing an animal thing. You would say it was defense or hunger or aggression. But it did not act like that. It acted like it was teaching me a lesson, drawing a boundary, and making sure I understood the rules without needing to finish it. That is why the memory sticks. That is why the smell still comes back to me sometimes when wet dog scent hits in cold air. That is why I still think about the way the wind died and the way the birds went silent like they were warned. And that is why when people talk about the woods like they are empty or like humans always have the advantage, I stay quiet. I know better. I do not need anyone to believe me for my own peace. I am not asking for attention. I am not trying to build some story bigger than it is. I am just saying what happened, because it changed how I walk in the places I used to trust without question. One more thing stays with me. After I got home and the adrenaline wore off, I realized my hands were marked with dirt where I grabbed the ground, and my knees were scraped from where I went down. Those are small details, but they remind me that the Dogman did not need to knock me down to put me in trouble. The terrain did it for free. If it had wanted me flat on the ground, it only had to push pressure a little harder at the right time, or force one more hard turn on loose rock. That is the part that makes me cautious even now. I also remember the moment the birds finally came back as I walked out. It was not immediate. It was gradual, like the place was waiting to make sure the line held. First a single call in the distance, then another, then a few small sounds in the brush. It felt like a release. That slow return of normal noise told me the predator pressure had truly lifted. I do not know if birds understand a Dogman the way they understand a cougar, but they knew enough to stay silent while it owned the space. When they started calling again, I took it as permission to keep moving, and I did not waste it. In the end, the truth of that day is simple. The Dogman could have ended it fast. Instead, it chose to show me how quickly safety can vanish, and how small you are when something else owns the advantage. That is why I remember it so clearly, and why I keep my distance from that part of the woods now.